The ideal education system should prepare students with the knowledge, skills, and moral character needed to thrive in a free, self-governing society. As the American conservative scholar Richard Weaver noted, a liberal education specifically prepares for the achievement of freedom. And as Jefferson wrote, the people are safe depositories of their own liberty and are not safe unless enlightened. Yet despite the dedication of many great teachers, and we'll just say some administrators, our current bureaucratic educational system remains grossly detached from this truth. So as I was looking into the federal kind of expansion of education, I was reminded that the actual big initial push started with the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, spurring efforts to improve our own math and science and expand access to college loans. However, the most dramatic growth in federal spending and oversight occurred during the War on Poverty and Great Society, initially aimed at promoting equality and preventing discrimination. Over time, these efforts have evolved into a rigid and bureaucratic system that stifles localized innovation and control. More on that in a few minutes. One of the most contentious examples, and I bring this up because my wife was a Title IX coordinator for a long time at a university here in North Carolina, at a private university, and the stories I could tell you would be much more interesting than this lecture just from talking to her about all the Title IX stuff. But I do bring up Title IX because it's so contentious. And really, Title IX, as many of you know, was passed by Congress in 1972 as part of the Education Amendments, wherein Title IX stipulates that discrimination on the basis of sex is prohibited in educational programs or entities accepting federal dollars. Over time, however, its interpretation has expanded far beyond its intent from the early 70s, especially under recent presidential administrations, to encompass gender identity rather than just biological sex. This shift has sparked controversy not only in K through 12 education, but higher education, where debates over transgender students' participation in sports, access to bathrooms, and policing politically correct or newspeak pronoun uses have become focal points of legal and cultural battles like we've talked about today. These changes are not enacted through Congress or the people's representatives, but through directives and dear colleague letters sent to the institutions by OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, offering guidance and language that purports to threaten the loss of federal funding. Title IX is often believed in the wider culture to be primarily about sports, but more often it deals with issues of sexual harassment as costs have soared for hearings and investigation and staffing Title IX coordinators at many institutions, as agency guidance letters have pushed terms like preponderance of the evidence, which you've probably read about in the news a few times, meaning more likely than not, or 50+1, as a burden of proof for harassment or assault, raising legitimate concerns about due process on college campuses more particularly. But many of us have seen Title IX play out nationally in recent years through figures like the pushback from former collegiate swimmer Riley Gaines, and even more specifically in hypercharged environments that we learned about from Luke in Northern Virginia, and Loudoun and Fairfax County. So the reinterpretation of Title IX was launched during the Obama administration, which issued guidance asserting that discrimination based on gender identity fell under the statute's protections. The Trump administration, of course, rescinded this guidance, emphasizing a return closer to the law's original intent when it was passed by Congress. But the Biden administration reinstated and further expanded the interpretation to explicitly include transgender students. This change has led to legal challenges and significant backlash from many parents, educators, and policymakers concerned about issues such as fairness in girls' sports, transparency for parents in schools, particularly privacy, and compelled speech. One example of the latter is school district in Virginia, recently, just last year, paid out a $575,000 settlement to a Christian French teacher terminated for supposed improper pronoun use. Alliance Defending Freedom secured the win. I highlight Title IX just because it has morphed into such a great example of a law or statute passed by Congress that has been completely inverted on its meaning. And it just means something entirely different than what it was meant to mean. Quickly, other prime examples of federal overreach include standardized testing and top-down educational mandates that have further eroded the ability for teachers to teach in the classroom, notably through further laws in the last 2 decades, such as No Child Left Behind, and its replacement, the Every Student Succeeds Act, enacted in 2015. The initiatives mandated testing to meet federal benchmarks, thus the rampant criticism of teaching to the test that strains more holistic learning for students with added focus on math and reading, at the expense of many other subjects and disciplines. Common Core, of course, a primary-led state initiative during the Obama administration, encouraged adoption of further one-size-fits-all education standards through federal funding, incentives like the Race to the Top program. As Eric Hanushek asked in a recent paper for the Hoover Institution Press, the question that we need to ask about federal intervention is whether the structure has worked in the sense of delivering educational outcomes that meet societal needs. Hanushek highlights some significant and pretty well-known facts for those in the education space. U.S. students are being outperformed in math by students in Spain, Italy, and 32 other countries. He noted that this is highly detrimental to our labor force, and economic growth does not bode well for the nation's future. Real people spending has risen continually for over 100 years, and funding for students in 2019 is 4 times greater than 1960 in inflation-adjusted dollars. There is no relationship, of course, we've mentioned this, but there is no relationship to discern that the National Assessment for Educational Progress scores are improving with increased funding. You've all seen the graphs. If I can do this, I'm trying to disinvert it, but you've all seen the graph, right? I mean, spending, outcomes. Everybody here, I think, has seen it. As Jay Green points out in his book, Education Myths, if money were the solution, the problem would already be solved. And as Betsy DeVos noted in a recent op-ed calling for the abolishment of the Department of Education, 7 out of 10 fourth graders do not read at grade level, and 6 in 10 fourth graders are behind in math. While the gaps, and this is important because this is the whole reason really that we have a Department of Education, and while the gaps between the lowest and highest performing students are the widest they have ever been. When it comes to federal overreach, another area of concern is school discipline. Policies under the guise of Dear Colleague letters in K-12 education to try and create parity in racial discipline. Looking at past racial discipline suspension or expulsion rates, federal administrators at the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Ed came up with the brilliant idea to aim towards numerical equity. In what appears to signal looking the other way, then Assistant Attorney General Kirsten Clark of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division said, discrimination in school can be devastating to long-term consequences on students and their future opportunities, which is true. Tacked onto that is the implied threat that federal funding could be in jeopardy through civil rights violations if schools didn't take action to address racial disparity in school discipline, with no mention about whether cultural implications, fatherlessness, or other components seem to contributing factors to behavior. But the cost can be immense, as Robert Padicio in the American Enterprise Institute talked about in an op-ed this month. Teachers got implicit bias training costing $2,000 to $10,000 per session with no guarantee that it works. Facilitators were hired or redirected, and new data systems tracked every classroom timeout by race. A conservative estimate of the cost of compliance would be $100 million to $200 million over several years, mostly in urban school districts desperate to avoid a civil rights investigation. But misspent dollars aren't even the worst of it. As student suspensions dropped to appease federal monitors, teachers complained, shockingly, that relaxed student discipline was creating classroom chaos. Compliance trumped learning, which ground to a halt. These letters don't show up in the education department budget, but they're fiscal vampires draining local resources under threat of enforcement and diverting staff time and attention from schools' primary business of teaching and learning. After all this, we know that President Trump has rightly moved to shutter the Department of Education. Congress should act too. There's been many bills before this has been talked about since it was implemented in the late 70s. Thankfully, I want to shift my focus and end here, but thankfully the states, acting as laboratories of democracies, are becoming more proactive in pushing back against a stale and broken educational system that has stunted academic and moral growth. And I think people have just lost confidence in, if you pay attention to any news or talk to people in your own neighborhoods. There are now 11 to 14 states, depending on how you define it, that make choice universal for K-12 students. In late 2024, North Carolina legislatures overrode the veto of then-Governor Roy Cooper to clear the 55,000 waitlist of the Opportunity Scholarship. But while policies that implement and aim for universal vouchers are great, particularly in our increasingly pluralistic and diverse society, school choice is no magic bullet. I believe this is an important truth too often missed by those engaged in public policy. Narrow focus on policy wins can overshadow the more fundamental question, what is the true purpose of education? This is the question that is not only elusive to, but especially of little interest to many educational administrative bureaucrats focused primarily on systems of propping up the government and unions. Likewise, if state education departments merely take funds through block grants, they run the risk of making the same mistakes via bureaucratic inefficiencies and ineffectual top-down mandates, just like the federal government. Some of you are already seeing the news headlines where state education departments are looking to poach laid-off or terminated federal workers to staff their own bureaucratic agencies, elevating the risk that entrenched bureaucratic thinking might be emboldened at the state level. And I bring up just kind of one anecdote that I'll share. My dad was an Air Force pilot, so I moved around a lot. And I had the fortunate experience of living in Hawaii, which was awesome, but the unfortunate experience of going to Hawaii public schools, which are pretty disastrous, especially when you compare them to, like, I went to Mississippi public schools, which aren't known to be great either, but compared to Hawaii, they seemed light years ahead. But in seventh grade, Planned Parenthood came to my classroom. It was kind of the day I became a social conservative. Not really knowing anything about Planned Parenthood, but they came in and taught us about, like, condoms, dental dams, all kinds of stuff, spermicidal jelly. And I will tell one quick, this is back in the very early 90s, like 1990, 91. So before, I guess, we were completely insane as a society. But one survey that I received in the class was, it asked me how many, and I was not a sheltered kid at all. I mean, I had older friends and I knew a lot of stuff, I was a middle school boy, I knew a lot. But I do want to say, like, Planned Parenthood they had this survey they gave you, and they said, how many times have you been laid? And I thought that meant that you, like, lied down and kissed a girl. So I was like, well, I'm kind of a Casanova, I'll just put 27 down. So I probably skewed the data a little bit. But I think it's important to note that, it's a huge victory to get rid of the Department of Education, but many state education departments blindly follow federal guidance and strings because they have not deeply thought out what kind of alternatives to offer students. After all, efforts to centralize education was started in the first place because of some failure at the state level. Local and not just state control is a huge component of our federalist system too. Furthermore, it's a much needed reminder that self-government means more of the hard decisions about education, and many of the controversies surrounding it should be done with our neighbors that we live in community with. It pushes us to ask the enduring question of our democracy or republic: what is our capacity for self-government? And I think that's very Tocquevillian, right? To try to, I think one of the things that we have to do better as a society is to govern ourselves, which was mentioned by Mr. Luddy, but also to be involved in our community and to be willing to engage in these tough decisions and controversies and engage the people that we don't disagree with in community. And I think the Roman Catholic teaching of subsidiarity offers some wisdom here, which reminds us that larger institutions in society, such as the state or federal government, should not overwhelm or interfere with smaller or local institutions such as the family, local schools, or the church community. Which brings us back to discovering the true purpose of learning. While school choice certainly helps us to better understand and pontificate that question, it's always vital that we ask that at the deeper level. It's clear that increasing state and local control of education is likely to be more responsive and reactive to the desires of parents and implementing the desires of like-minded communities. Again, the explosion of school choice policies in the states is a stark example of this right now. But I do want to say, when it comes to the purpose of education, there's some great words from Russell Kirk that I wanted to share. The primary purpose of a liberal education, then, is the cultivation of the person's own intellect and imagination, for the person's own sake. It ought not to be forgotten in this mass age when the state aspires to be all in all, that genuine education is something higher than an instrument of public policy. True education is meant to develop the individual human being, the person, rather than to serve the state. It's essential to note that beyond the centralization of education policy that has weakened outcomes, it has also weakened the moral and civic formation of local communities and pitted neighbors against each other along more nationalized issues with coercement of federal funding at the very forefront. As a parent, that moment for me and my wife exiting a good public school in our state of North Carolina was primarily about the soul, the main reason being a simple truth. How can we talk about the transcendent and Trinitarian God at home and church and accept it being completely ignored in a primary learning environment? I'm also reminded of the words of the late, great Admiral James Bond Stockdale. He's a big hero of mine. All those men that suffered in those North Vietnamese prison camps, I've read a lot of their books. I like military history. And they had freedom so violently taken away from them, and they were very kind of old-fashioned and conservative men, but they were counterintuitive thinkers in some ways, and I'll bring this out. Stockdale, he said that the challenge of education is really about, the big challenge in education, his words were like basically setting you up to understand, to accept failure in life. And he studied the Stoics, and he talks about, in his book, the Philosophical Fighter Pilot, I think is the name of the book. I just read it when I was working at the Acton Institute. It was on the library shelf, and it was an amazing book. And he talks about how he survived his ordeals and became really the model example of how to help others survive, and essentially almost gave his life so that others would survive in that horrendous condition. But he talked about the importance of the Stoics in his education. Even before he had been shot down, he had been a student at the Hoover Institute and had studied Epictetus. And he said that allowed me to not be an optimist or a pessimist, but to survive the situation and be a realist. And he said, Epictetus said, "A podium and a prison is each a place, one high and the other low, but in either place your freedom of choice can be maintained so if you wish, reinforcing that real freedom lies in inner control and the ability to choose one's response to circumstances, not merely external conditions." And I think that kind of sums up a little bit of the hardship which Mr. Luddy was talking about today, that to be somebody who's willing to face difficult things, to be disciplined in your mind and in your soul, and not just be merely influenced by external outcomes. And I think that just provides a good example for us today, and I really appreciate your time. And it's glad to see the Department of Education is gone, but there's still so much work to do at the state and local level, and with the expansion, I think, of choice, which just gives people more viable alternatives to a system that they've lost trust in. So thank you.